Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second lecture of this week, which I'm calling 50 Shades of What? Focusing on sex normativity and patriarchy. So, before I begin this lecture, I do kind of want to make some claimers. So, one is that this lecture is not about slut shaming. This lecture is also not about anti porn or shaming sexually explicit content. This lecture especially is not about shaming those of you listening to this about what you do or how you feel about your body, your private areas, your sexual fantasies, what clothes you wear, all of that, okay? But this lecture is looking critically at the way sex, especially female sexuality, is framed in society, both within popular culture as well as within the medical industry. So, to start this off, I want to start talking about popular culture because I think that will lead us into talking about the very complicated history medicine has had around female sexuality. And no newsflash here, it's not been good. But we're going to first focus on the media and the objectification of women. And, with that, then the hypersexualization of women. And even when I say women, I'm including a lot of all ages because young girls, like little girls, teenagers, and so forth, are incredibly hypersexualized in our society. Not alone, not alone. Also, women over the age of legal consent and so forth. To begin talking about the hypersexualization, the objectification of women in the media, we need to first talk about how sex and sexuality are always gendered. In that, the way that we talk about sex and the way that whether that's sex acts, being sexy, being sexual, to expressing our sexual desires, our sexual orientations, always has a gendered component to it. And that how we also regulate sex and sexuality is also gendered. And regulation not only in the sense of laws, but how the medical industry has regulated sex and sexuality. And I think a lot of you would understand this in the sense of if I asked you a question around, clothing or even expressing a desire to engage in sex with somebody, consensual sex with somebody. And I just said, this person is acting very sexy or wants to engage in sex or is trying to be sexually explicit. Immediately, the scenario will change if I say this is a guy doing this versus a girl. And that alone, the fact that the gender of the person, the actor doing it, makes a difference on how we perceive their actions. So a man, asking whoever, a woman, man, anybody within the gender spectrum around for sex or being very sexually desirable or even, showing off some skin is going to have a very much, different sort of thoughts around them. A lot of times it's very much more positive or even accepted versus a woman, you know? A question that I always like to ask my students is that, when you were in high school, and admittedly many of you taking this class are not that far removed from high school, when I asked about the slurs, like who, who was called a slut in your school, or who was like, and not naming not specifically who, but what gender was called a slut. It was always girls. It was always the young women. Men, even though they could have, the boys in your high school probably had as much sexual engagement, probably even way more than the young women at your high school. But more often than not, they're not called sluts. They're not called hoes. They're not called whores or anything like that. I mean, that alone shows you that there's a gendered script around sexuality. But so often, why is that? Why is there such a difference between, just the word slut, that it often always applies to women versus men? Well, a lot of that is because how women and girls' bodies and sexuality are always framed in the context of male sexual desire or needs, always in service of, right? So you are a slut because you have sex, oh, if you're a woman, because you presumably have sex with several other men. And that's not serving a male's sexual desire who wants to own one woman, one property, and that your sexuality, even your sexual parts, belong to a person, namely a man. And while these, gendered scripts and regulation, sort of social taboos around female sexuality do obviously favor men, they also do a disservice to men. And I'm going to talk about this in a little bit. But I first want to talk about, how it's not just about how we shame women and sex, and we do shame women a lot, but also how popular culture has made it so that it's naturalized, it's normal to objectify women's bodies and so forth. For those of you who've taken women's studies classes, these images are not at all, one, shocking, or two, anything new. But for those of you who haven't taken a women's studies course, feminist media scholars, feminist cultural scholars have really sort of talked about and interrogated the way that media, and a great way to look at it is through advertising, has hypersexualized and objectified women to the point that they become merely objects, right? In a lot of advertisements, you cannot walk outside your door, to see a woman's body. And oftentimes it's like cut apart, you only see a leg, or she's used as furniture, or she's in a very sexually explicit position, right? There's like no mistake what her body and the message is trying to convey. And oftentimes, these images, they're not meant to be jokes. They are taken very seriously. And a lot, I have students, whenever I talk about this, some students will bring up, well, what about men? Because men also have, there are definitely advertisements out there that show just a man's chest or show a very hunky, sexy model guy, right? And he's, being provocative or so forth. And a lot of times they bring out the Old Spice guy, like, what about him? Like, isn't he, objectified? And you're right, men are also objectified. But one, to a far, 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 far less degree. And two, a lot of times it's part of the joke. The Old Spice guy, the reason why he's funny is because we don't look at men that way. We don't look at men as just being hunky, sexy objects, right? That's why it's funny. But these, and there is a little bit of humor into them, like the Katy Perry one, which is disgusting. But for most of the times, like the Budweiser and many of these ads, they are not meant to be funny. That's not what the message is. It's not supposed to be humor. It's supposed to be very serious. And it's very much targeted to a male gaze. A gaze that is very much around women being objects for men to not only view, but to consume. As I said before, there are many feminists within the field of women's studies and other disciplines who have written extensively and have done so much great work around gender and media and so forth. One that I want to highlight is Dr. Caroline Hellman, who's done just incredible work in this area as well as many other areas. And she gave a TED Talk, which is called The Sexy Lie, and I encourage you all to look it up. But I'm just going to give you highlights from her talk. Because, it's not to say that this idea of being sexy as empowering is something new, because, that's been around forever, right? This idea that selling to a lot of times young girls and young women that, being sexually explicit, is actually empowering, and that, you should embrace it, and you shouldn't think of it as anything that you should be ashamed of, and so forth. And on one hand, that's great, for yourself to be sexually empowered, to feel what you want to feel, to wear what you want to wear is fantastic. But the idea of a sex object as being empowering, that's where we need to critique. So, sexual objectification is the process of representing or treating a person like a sex object, just an object, no agency, thought, or anything, like a book or a remote or a shoe, right? Those are objects. And one that serves another sexual pleasure or another person's pleasure, namely men's. Now, objectification culture, as Caroline talks about, has emerged in the past 10 years, and it's marked by two things. One is an increase in the number of sexually objectifying ads in television, movies, video games, music videos, magazines, and then just the internet. The second is the advertising component, is that the image had become much more extreme and more hypersexualized. A great example is this shoe company, which took little girls and dressed them up as women, styled them as women, and put them in very sexually, provocative photo shoots. And, a lot of why we're experiencing this sort of much more onslaught of sexually objectifying media images is because of technology. New technology has increased the sheer number of images that you are exposed to every day. Like, as Caroline talks about, like in the 70s, we saw about 500 ads a day. Now we see about 5,000 ads a day. And if you think about children who ages 8 to 18, are spending an average of 8 hours a day on devices. So they're seeing just advertisements nonstop. And, so with that, then the advertisers have to find ways to reach to people because you're seeing so many. So they cut through the clutter by making it, much more violent, much more hypersexualized, much more sexually explicit. And this then leaves an impression on young women. Like, if the images that you see of women, especially as you're trying to develop your own sense of who you are as a woman, is very hypersexualized and objectified, well, then you're going to start thinking, well, maybe that's empowering, and maybe that's what I need to be and how I should be. And as Caroline says, the more we think of ourselves and internalize this idea of sex objects, the higher our rates of depression. It also engages in habitual body monitoring. What is that? So habitual body monitoring she talks about, it's really about, constantly for young women, but, men as well, but a lot of times it's focused on young women, of this idea of making sure that we look good at all times. So, the positioning of our hair, where the light is falling, who's looking at us, who's not looking at us. I know for myself as a woman that I engage in habitual body monitoring so much that I don't even think about it, straightening my dress or straightening my, like brushing back my hair, or worried about leaning too much, or when I'm sitting in a room with people and so forth. I mean, that's why it's so comforting to be in the privacy of your own home where you can fully relax, because as a woman, at least from my own experiences, that sort of thing of feeling relaxed does not happen, because you're constantly worried about not only how other men are viewing you, but also how other women are viewing you. And as Caroline Hellman says, habitual body monitoring is, takes up a lot of mental space, right? That could be used for anything. It sucks our cognitive functioning, but it also leads to sexual dysfunction. This idea that sex sells it's strange that if you think of yourself as a sex object, and we are raised in a society that raises little girls to view their bodies as projects to work on and be sex objects, that it gets in way of good sex. Like, And that's what Caroline argues. She's like, it's this interesting thing of like little girls, young women are now, sort of being bombarded with this message of being sex objects. So you would think that they would be, having great sex, but they're not, because again, of all this feelings of you have to act a certain way, you have to be a certain way, you have to look a certain way, gets in a way with actually them connecting to their inner core of who they are sensually, sexually, like what do they want? What makes them feel good? What makes them feel enlivened and emboldened, both within engaging in sex, but then outside of sex as well. Having that sort of core sense of understanding, some of your most interpersonal ideas, places, bodies, and so forth. And Caroline talks about that what tends to happen is that women who are highly self-objectified, so engaging in this habitual body monitoring, feeling that they need to be sex objects and so forth, engage in what's called spectator sex. And instead of being involved and engaged in the pleasure of what's happening with their partner, you tend to view yourself from a third party perspective, a spectator's perspective. So you're so worried about how you look while you're engaging in sex that you have no way of actually being present in the moment. And it leads to then these feelings of, one, you're not being satisfied, but two, also feeling that you're not good enough or you don't deserve to be satisfied. So that is sexual objectification of women in the media and how it can lead to bad sex, right? If you see yourself so much as a sex object, if we're told constantly that we need to look this good while we're having sex, or we need to just look this good in period, and then when we're caught in the act, we're so worried and we can't relax, we can't calm down. Well, it's part of this larger vicious cycle around how women are very much their own core sense, because everyone should own their own sexuality, their own sensuality, their own desires, their own bodies. If it's seen as always in the service of men's pleasure or their partner's pleasure and so forth, then it's hard for any person, especially for women, to actually know what they like, how they like, and so forth. And it breeds or it leads into this myth around female orgasms. If you just sort of Google, and don't Google female orgasm, because I did that and I got very different results that would probably be blocked at the IPFW computers. But when you look at popular discussions around female orgasms, there are always these two things. One, that women's orgasms are always so difficult, like as if they were this crazy code and you have to, I don't know, it's like the Da Vinci Code or something. I don't know. They're so complicated. Why bother? Or that women can't have orgasms. Or they're like this mystery box that not even women know how to solve, but for men it's straightforward, right? So already you have a narrative that is very much, joked about and talked about in popular culture around female orgasms as being, one, this sort of unachievable holy grail, or that two, they're not necessary, or that they don't even exist. And this leads into the way that we talk about, or young women especially, think about their bodies and sex and talk about sex. So Peggy Orenstein wrote this really great book, and she's an amazing feminist author, called Girls and Sex, and I highly encourage any of you, if you haven't read it, read it. It's very gripping. It's very much personal narratives and so forth, and it's really, really interesting. But she writes about that despite this sort of hype, and there's always this hype, that teenagers are engaging in so much sex, this was happening when I was a kid. This was happening when my sister was a kid, who's 10 years older than me. I'm sure this was happening during when my mother was a kid. This sort of, this, frenzy, this panic around teenagers engaging in way too much sex. But the truth is that, despite the hype, teenagers aren't engaging in more sex than they were before. Or, but at the same time, teenagers are engaging in different types of sex than they were before and more frequency. One is, for example, oral sex. And so in this book, Peggy interviews several girls from all different sort of socioeconomic, racial, etc. backgrounds. And a lot of the girls talk about having to bargain, and that a lot of times that bargaining is that, a girl might like a boy and the boy immediately expects whatever, some sort of sex to happen. So a girl will give oral sex to the young boy just to sort of either get out of a situation, make that boy feel good, because the girl herself is not ready to have either, vaginal intercourse. But what's really interesting about this is that, yes, this girl will be like, okay, I'll give you a blowjob, but it's never reciprocal. Meaning that the girls never want it to happen to them. They never want the boys to give them oral sex, which seems like, why not? Like, you're going to give this guy one? Why can't he give you yours? And a lot of it is because of the shaming around how young girls see their bodies. So Peggy talks about that, many of the girls she interviews expressed a lot of shame about their genitals. Women's feelings about their genitals have been directly linked to their enjoyment of sex. And that, that girls' genital self-image is under siege, with more pressure than ever to, see them as unacceptable in their natural state. And according to research, about 3/4 of college women remove their pubic hair, all of it at least on occasion. More than half do so regularly. Girls would tell Peggy when she interviewed them that it would make removing their hair made them feel cleaner, as if it was a personal choice. And a lot of it is due to this porn, which shows pretty much only one type of vagina, which is a shaved vagina. And also just one type of vagina, that's called the porn vagina, which, has very little inner labia showing, very little outer labial. It's a very, very much like a Barbie vagina, right? Very smooth, flat, tight, and compact, which vaginas come in all shapes and sizes, and they're all beautiful. Yet we've sort of, if girls are learning about themselves through porn because they're not being taught about it, they're not really having comprehensive health and sex education, particularly around their bodies in high schools, middle schools, and so forth, then they're feeling incredible amounts of shame about what's going on in between in between their legs. And there's, of course, a lot of shame around shaving, to the point that, their male partners will be like, I don't want to go down there if it's not shaved. That's gross, even though they're not shaved. So I'm like, whoa, all right. And then, feelings around smell and taste, as if vaginas are always yucky. And the girls talk about in this book about how they see their vaginas as yucky. But another thing about that is, because girls are first not being taught about just the wide variety of their bodies, and instead it's always very much that the girls learn one thing. They learn about periods and ovulation, but that's it. They don't learn anything else about their vagina health. They don't learn about the variety and so forth. All of us then framed around men, right? Because young boys, when they get sex ed health and all that, they learn all about ejaculation, they learn all about their penises. Girls don't. Girls don't learn about that. They don't even learn about orgasms for themselves. They don't even learn about that. So even from a young age and so forth, even with fundamental education that they get, it's always framed around a male's partner's sex and satisfaction. And, Peggy says in her research that she found that young women were more likely than young men to use their partner's pleasure as a measure of their satisfaction. So they say things like, if he's sexually satisfied, then I'm sexually satisfied. And young men were more likely to measure their satisfaction by their own orgasm, right? But very interesting, getting to the absence of pain as the low bar for sexual fulfillment. Young women, when they were asked, Peggy asked them about what's bad sex, they said differently. Basically they said that if it wasn't painful, then it was good. I mean, that's the low bar, that, as long as it wasn't painful, we had good sex. Even though, the largest survey ever conducted of American sexual behavior, women reported pain in their sexual encounters 30% of the time. The girls interviewed by Peggy talked about it being depressing, humiliating, and degrading. And again, using pain as the bar of sexual satisfaction, using that their partner got off as oh well, then we had good sex. Not alone about if you got off, if you climaxed or anything, or you even enjoyed your time. It's such a low bar. And a lot of it again is about lack of knowledge about their own bodies. So, when young boys are taught about their bodies, a lot of times they're taught, this is your penis and so forth, or your pee-pee if you want to go there. But women aren't taught these words. They're never taught a lot of times about vulva or clitoris. And no surprise that when Peggy did her research, that fewer than half of the teenage girls aged 14 to 17 have ever masturbated. And then they go into their partner experience, and we expect that somehow they'll think sex is about them, that they'll be able to articulate their needs, their desires, their limits. It's so unrealistic. And so, and this leads to then also these ideas around the pressures of virginity, that, well, you shouldn't need to be learning this because you should be saving yourself for ideally your male partner and so forth. And it leads to what feminists have called the orgasm gap. Just like the wage gap, there is an orgasm gap where men are still likely to climax, or still twice as likely, to climax as women. And it's one of the most enduring forms of gender inequality, and it's kind of growing wider and wider because the education that young girls are getting, as well as young boys, they're not taught about understanding their partner's needs either. And, it's not to say that men are selfish pigs. We're doing a disservice to both around sex and sexuality and sexual pleasure and sexual empowerment and knowledge about what they want and what they need. So this gets into again about how women and young girls have been taught about their bodies, particularly their vaginas. And it makes total sense in the sense of what Peggy Orenstein had discovered. Because think about how vaginas are sort of treated in society as being either that they are hairy and need to be contained, or that they have, odors or stuff like that. And it's no surprise that when we have not only pop culture that are telling us that our, vaginas are gross, nasty things, and then we have lack of education around it, that, especially sex education, that young girls feel their vaginas as being yucky or as being something that they should be ashamed of. But it wasn't only popular culture or even sex education that leads to this. It's also been the medical field. So here's some facts for you. In 1969, we put a man on the moon, right? Crowning achievement. In 1982, we invented the internet. Big, big crowning achievement. In, wait for it, 1998, we discovered the full anatomy of the clitoris. 1998. we discovered the full anatomy of the clitoris. What? So we have to go back a little bit. So Grey's Anatomy, not the TV show that my mother loves so dearly, but the book that is seen as the fundamental text of medical knowledge. I mean, if you're going into medicine, especially if you're going as a doctor or a surgeon or anything in the specialized field, you will learn Grey's Anatomy. You will have a copy of Grey's Anatomy, and you will use it as a key text to understand the body and so forth. Especially if you're a surgeon where you're cutting into flesh, you need to know, this as much as possible, and you have to study it. Well, so as this founding text, for a long time, for over almost 100 years, the clitoris was erased from the medical drawings of the vagina. And in fact, it was actually in 1947, Dr. Charles Mayo completely erased the clitoris, not from the actual human body, of course, but from the anatomical designs that represented it in Grey's Anatomy. And whether he did that for moral reasons or he just didn't think it was necessary is up for debate. But what it did do is that you have doctors poring over this text and having no understanding of the knowledge that they need around a very important piece of anatomy. Now, I don't think it's surprising to tell you that the penis and all of its multitude of nerve endings and so forth was very much mapped out and remained mapped out in the medical texts. But for the vagina, it was gone. Clitoris was gone, and all the nerve endings and so forth. And this makes a big deal because when you have surgeons, doing any sort of surgeries, particularly surgeries involving, going through the vaginal wall or so forth, they could be cutting into some very vital nerve tissues that can affect a woman's sexual pleasure, function, and so forth. Really important, right? And there's just horrible stories that you can look up about women who, years prior to 1988, when it was fully mapped out, that, had to go in for whatever sort of operations or surgeries, and then losing a vital part of themselves and, cause incredible amounts of depression and despair. And, if this, again, would have happened to a penis, a person owning a penis, if that happened, there would have been much more outrage. But there you have it. Now, I'm going to go into the not so great history of how the Western societies treated the female orgasm a little bit later. But just to give you a little taste, the Malleus Maleficarum, also called the Witch's Hammer, which is this seminal text by the Inquisition to hunt out witches, namely independent, smart women, and used as the persecution of women, said that the clitoris was the devil's teat and claims it is evidence as dealings with the devil or witchcraft. Fun historical fact. Anyways, getting back to 1998. So, for decades, Grey's Anatomy alone, but then other medical knowledge as well. So it's not just Grey's Anatomy, but just pretty much all medical knowledge did not have a comprehensive mapping of the clitoris and all of its both external and internal nerve endings and so forth. And it wasn't until 1998 that Helen O'Connell, who is an Australian urologist, publishes the findings that challenge nearly every belief of clitoral anatomy to date. She managed to map out the clitoris in its external and internal entirety, demonstrating not only its immense size, but its sizable stock of nerve endings. The clitoris has 2 to 3 times more nerve endings than the penis. And she writes that, this knowledge was so, one is she was almost shocked by the lack of knowledge, but how important this knowledge is that, you know, so much about the clitoris, even the knowledge that was there, was external, and you forget about how much more nerve endings there are. Nerve endings that go all the way up through the base of the spine. And for her, I mean, now there's a bit more research been going on, and she sort of started this, her work was the first to sort of start mapping it out. In 2009, the stimulated clitoris was sonically photographed. And this research was also really revolutionary because it explained how what we once considered to be a vaginal orgasm is actually just an internal clitoral orgasm, because the clit goes all the way through the vaginal wall, all the way through, up through the base of the spine, and so forth. It's a very mighty and powerful thing that has been sorely neglected for over many decades. The terrible history of the clit, at least in medical science, is indicative of how we see not only women's bodies as text, but just even physiological reactions as text. So, people learn what to feel in sex as much as they learn what to do. And sexual events are deeply social, even when they happen alone. And for people to understand a bodily sensation as sexual, it needs to have a place in a script that labels and organizes it. So the thing is that babies, young children, can have an orgasm. It's not like that when you reach, sexual maturity in your teenager's puberty that now you have orgasms. No, children can have orgasms. It's just physiological stimulation. But because we don't have a script on that, we don't say like this is sexually an orgasm. It just sort of goes around and it happens. I mean, I have pediatrician friends, and they talk a lot about how parents come in, in a fear and panic over their baby. What looks like that the baby's having a fit. In reality, the baby just had an orgasm, right? But again, we have to put it into the script of what is sexual and what is not. So already, we have these physiological expressions, experiences, but we put them in a script. A very much a gendered script. And that leads to then how we think about problems, reflects social expectations rather than actual physical problems or dysfunctions. So the orgasm is always gendered. If it is a script, it is always gendered. And again, going back to what I said before, how the female body is a text, it's mostly served as for the male gaze, the male power, gender hierarchy. We see this in advertisements. The female orgasm is also a text or a script of gender. It's only in relationship to male desire. Labeling female bodies as dysfunctional who have either they don't have an orgasm, or they don't have the correct way to have an orgasm, or their orgasms aren't what is seen on porn or TV, or go up to the male expectation. And female orgasm is either way too difficult to even care about, let alone put into a medical textbook about what is needed for a female orgasm, the clit, to something that's dirty or taboo. And it speaks again to the medicalization of the female body and sexual response. And this gets into a larger discussion around female orgasms. And I'm going to talk a bit about hysteria and the vibrator, and how female sexual dysfunction is the new hysteria. So, a very brief history of orgasms, how female orgasms have been treated in Western society. So, in Celtic tribes and in ancient Rome, sexual pleasure for both men and women was seen as not only a must, but also important in regards to childbearing. It had religious significance. many fertility rites. The female orgasm was seen as something powerful and very much important. That party ended with the onset of Christianity, which very much restricted sexual and sexual acts, specifically female sexual acts. Remember, Eve is the one who ate the apple first, right? We need to control female sexuality because it can doom all of humanity. And in fact, if you were a good Christian during medieval Europe, you could only have sex on certain days, and they had to fall on specific holidays, making it so that you could have sex for 60 days a year. Good times. Of course, who actually followed those rules is up to debate. But yeah, sexuality, having sex was repressed, but funnily enough, the orgasm was not. There was this idea that it was believed that in order to have a child, both partners needed to orgasm. Basically, a female orgasm was seen as like an oven, that it would heat the oven to cook the baby, right? To create the conception and making a delicious baby, I guess. And, there was even tips by medieval doctors to stimulate the clitoris to ensure female orgasm so that there would be conception. So, as much as we can talk, and there's fair enough to talk about how sexuality was very much repressed during the early days of Christianity and in medieval Europe, at least orgasms were seen as at least somewhat important. The problem with this idea that in order for conception, a woman must orgasm is that you already have guessed, is that it's still being used today, this medieval logic, by legitimate rape apologists like Todd Aiken, who thinks that female pleasure is necessary to conceive a baby, which means that if you are raped and get pregnant, you must have orgasmed, and so it can't actually have been raped. Amazing. Just to reiterate, an orgasm is not needed for conception, despite what Todd Aiken might believe. So going on in history, sex and the female orgasm kind of stayed the same for a long time, in the sense that, orgasm were seen as necessary for conception and so forth. But it really was the onset of colonization and industrialization that you get the Victorian suppression of female sexuality to the extreme that we are now still living with today. So, colonization, invading people's lands, acting, just the thought that you go into a person's land, you go into a person's homeland and say, this is not yours anymore, and we can control it better than you, and we are now going to be your overlords, takes an incredible amount of mental gymnastics to try to put yourself as superior than the people that you are controlling. Well, one way of that mental gymnastics was around sex and sexuality, where you had these Western colonists going into countries, in Africa, South Asia, and so forth, Middle East, and looking at these cultures who had, possibly different ways or different ideas or morals or sets around sex, sexuality, displaying bodies, and so forth, that ran in contrast to sort of Christian morality. That doesn't mean that sex and sexuality wasn't also regulated within these societies, within their own culture, but it ran in contrast to Christian morality. Well, these colonizers could then say that, well, we are the moral subjects, we are pure and chaste, unlike you heathens who are incredibly sexually explicit and so forth. So there was a long history, and still continues today, of the hypersexualization of colonized people to create where colonized people were seen as overly sexually explicit, sexually lustful, in contrast to Europeans, and that's why they were then considered as having no morals or being filthy, dirty savages, essentially. So you would have the contrast of, for example, Sarah Bartman, who was a South African woman who went on tour in the carny shows in the 1800s, where people would look at her body, and, be shocked by her ample buttocks or her vagina or whatever. And you would do these things in order to make a contrast. So you have Sarah Bartman, or equivalent, of being overly lustful. And then Europeans, especially colonists, created this idea of the chaste Victorian lady with no carnal lust, and she's just here for children, and she's a virgin until marriage, and then even still, she's kind of virginy and so forth. And just an important reminder that colonialism did not just happen in countries outside of North America. North American settlers, colonists, did the very same things, sort of practices to Native Americans, African Americans, and non-white immigrants. But one part of this colonization was, again, if you have to create this idea that women are these moral chaste things, then the female orgasm, out the door. The other part of destroying the female orgasm, and again, the idea that it's necessary and so forth, not that women still didn't climax at this time, but very much seen as something that's dirty and taboo, was industrialization, which very much changed society and it changed social structures within the larger empires and in North America, where you have the birth of cities. So you have different groups of people moving in from the rural countryside to these cities. And very importantly, you have this new birth of the middle class. Whereas before, you had, basically the aristocrats and then the rest, the peasants. Now you have different layers of society, and this middle class develops. And this middle class was very much about, again, trying to separate itself from its poorer counterparts, right? The ones working in the factories and so forth. And there was this new idea of separating yourself, especially from the lower class and the poorer class. The lower class being seen as having way too much sex and lust. They are poor, they're dirty, they're having way too many kids. And as a response to racism and classism, female sexualities, particularly for the middle class and upper, sexual expression desire was repressed in order to hold themselves, I guess, morally superior. And that sort of idea, this popular conception around female sexuality as being something that's dirty, taboo, and that the right way is to be this sort of Victorian chaste lady, which we still have. We still have remnants of this. It's not anything gone. Was very much based on oppression of lower class people, poor people, colonized people, non-white people. The Industrial Revolution brought a lot of social changes, and one of it has been our medical institutions. The way that we see of hospitals and the modern clinic, and medicine being this sort of profession that has schools and protocols and so forth, came out of industrialization. So, the birth of the modern hospital, right? And with that, then, this idea of medicalizing and institutionalizing different facets of society, very much focused also on the mentally ill. So before, people who, went outside of social norms, protocol, practices, may be punished, even killed for going against God's commandments, or they were seen as being possessed by the devil or spirits. And that's to say that it's not good either. So, if you think about people in the past, like if you had bipolarism, schizophrenia, just so many PTSD, like so many things that, that can be cared for and should be cared for, were treated, with suspicion, fear, and so forth. Well, now these individuals with these conditions, and a range of conditions more than that, were seen as wards of the state and were institutionalized. So The 19th century birthed the field of psychiatry, really exploring the anatomical reasons for certain behaviors. And of course, like all medicine who had access to research, study, and write, and ultimately prescribe mental conditions were mostly men, right? And a select group of white men, especially. Women were barred from entering medicine until the 1930s. Men of color were given limited to no access until the 1950s. So it's not surprising that to understand that these early psychiatrists were way off their diagnosis and treatment. And one was around the treatment of women. So think about this time. It's in Victorian England, and there were, incredible restrictions on women from all classes of society, but especially also for middle class and upper class women, because again, this idea that they have to set themselves apart. So not only are they wearing incredibly restrictive clothing, literally clothing, these corsets that can change your physical and your internal organs, but then also just all these other things that were incredibly restrictive towards women at the time. Basically you could barely leave your house and so forth. And again, at this time, women had no legal rights. They were dead in the eyes of the law. They were seen as property. You would have this string of women, I think, out of really just sort of mental duress, experiencing fainting spells, depression, mood swings, anger, not being the submissive, demure little virginal housewives they were supposed to be as proper middle class English women and so forth. So, psychiatrists at the time, are getting these floods of women who are, being emotionally unstable and so forth, and they're like, what is going on? They create this new mental condition called hysteria. So, women were then being sent to mental clinics on the basis of hysteria. And, a lot of these women were upper class women. So it was really sort of this panic around what is going on? What are we going to do with our women? Not thinking about the social conditions that these women are, that maybe that's why they might be a bit hysterical. Instead, seeing that these women are mentally diseased, right? So they started thinking about a range of treatments. And one treatment that sort of showed to be effective was pelvic massages. Look at this photo very carefully. And hopefully you see something's going on with that pelvic massage. These pelvic massages were really popular. Basically, they were giving women orgasms. Now, here's the thing. The doctors doing these, and these are trained medical doctors giving these massages to women, did not know that what they were doing was giving a woman an orgasm. Because again, the orgasm was kind of erased from history. And if all orgasms are framed on male orgasms, well then a woman doesn't have an orgasm. They became so popular that a whole wave of industry started creating new gadgets for women to do them at home. So you don't have to have the inconvenience of going to a doctor to get that massage. You can do that at home. What does that look like? What does that look like? Oh, we still have it today. So that is the birth of the vibrator. It came out of a medicalization of a female dysfunction. And now doctors later on stopped doing this practice, and they kind of realized they were giving women orgasms. But it speaks again, this history, the funny history of the vibrator and the birth of the vibrator, is that again, it was very much a gendered script, where you have this mental disease that women are experiencing, that they clearly are hysterical and therefore they need these medical treatments, are ignoring, again, one, women as being subjects, but two, always seeing their bodies in the male gaze, as objects, as something, if it doesn't happen to men, then it doesn't happen at all, and so forth. So we've come a long way, right? From hysteria, which was pretty much a made up disease by male psychiatrists at the time to describe women's conditions. Um, but the medical field has still very much obsessed over women and their sexuality and their sexual expressions and so forth. Now there's this thing called female sexual dysfunction, and it is considered to be real by the medical society, which is characterized by a persistent or reoccurrent inability to attain sexual arousal or to maintain arousal until the completion of a sexual activity, oftentimes defined as female to male intercourse. That's oftentimes what sexual activity is defined as. And it's a lot of times categorized as persistent, recurrent problems with sexual response, desire, orgasm, or pain, the distress that distresses the person or strains her relationship with her partner. And it's defined by low sexual desire. The most common of female sexual dysfunctions involves a lack of sexual interest and willingness to be sexual. Sexual arousal disorder. Your desire for sex might be intact, but you have difficulty with arousal or are unable to become aroused or maintain arousal during sexual activity. Orgasmic disorder. You have a persistent or recurrent difficulty in achieving orgasm after sufficient sexual arousal or ongoing stimulation. And sexual pain disorder. You have pain associated with sexual stimulation or vaginal contact. And there have been numerous products on the market around trying to target female sexual dysfunction. Whether that's the Lady Viagra to like implants women can have. But the truth is that as much as there has been, billions and billions of dollars to address female sexual dysfunction, most of them don't work. And the reason is that it's not about a pill. It's not about an implant. It's about society, a lot of it. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't physiological or anatomical barriers that some women might have in regards to climaxing. I'm not saying that. But for the large majority of it, when you have already been taught that your bodies are something to be shameful of, that your sexuality, your sexual desires and needs need to be in service of somebody else, that your own sense of self is not valid or worth even exploring, how can you expect women to have an orgasm? And to have an orgasm that, I guess, fits within a very limited definition of what is a good orgasm versus a bad orgasm. And until we start teaching our young girls and women about their bodies in a way that fully embraces differences and is very much about affirmation versus condemnation, then we're going to continue on where women are almost bifurcated from their essential core self, which is, I think, everyone, regardless or not if you identify as a sexuality, even if you identify as asexual, you're still a sexual being. You still have a core to yourself, a core that is very much yours and yours alone, and that you have a right to. But we have a society have worked very hard in all fields and institutions to deny women their right to their own sexual bodies. I started this lecture talking about ads and media advertising. I then went on to the medical field, and I want to end up on what I titled this darn presentation on, which is 50 Shades, but not explicitly about 50 Shades, though we will talk about 50 Shades, but the way that maybe we're even taught about romance affects our sexual desires and pleasures and so forth. Because it's not just the medical field or advertisements that objectify women, but also put whatever a woman sort of desires in a male gaze, but also the way that we teach around intimacy. So these are just some photos of the recent, romantic movies, which is a whole genre, coming out in 2018. And one, I mean, there's some things that you can notice. One, they're all white, but two, they're all heterosexual. I mean, it's very rare to see a mainstream movie or even TV show portray, same-sex partners. But oftentimes, also these romance movies, well, they follow a pattern, which is very much a girl, either being pursued by or pursuing a man, and pretty much that is the whole arc of her storyline. And we've talked about this before about how women are very much framed in stories as either serving male needs or that the only thing that they want to do is around men. So again, obsession over that. And even in shows that are very much about trying to be sexually explicit and desirable to cater to a female audience, that script is pretty much the same. And that's how we get to 50 Shades. So, the last movie came out this year, thank God. But it's never gonna leave us. I went to see 50 Shades with my mother. Let's not talk about the therapy bills that ensued. But I also went to see the book club with my mother, which she also loved. And I don't know why I have a poster that's not in English, but never mind. Anyways, to talk about the hype of 50 Shades. So there's been so much hype around it. One, that, it whips women now finally are discovering sex with 50 Shades. That, they want to try out sex toys and so forth. And they want to have sex, finally, because of this book. And that especially not only women, but older women. Women that we've just assumed sexless. Because I guess after 35, you lose your everything. I don't know. That they also want to have sex. Shocking. And that, women want to be more confident in their bedrooms and so forth. Okay, so here's this thing. One is that women, regardless of their age, are sexual beings and have sexual desires. That is not shocking. But two, 50 Shades did not, have women discover their sexuality. But at the same time, I think it's important to critique, one, the hype around 50 Shades as being this, one, that it's like sexually revolutionary, and that two, it's empowering towards women. And that's where you're going to get to your assignment. Because what I want you to think about with 50 Shades is that here's this book series industry. It is an industry. I mean, it has its hands in everything. That is very much marketed as being empowering towards women and revolutionary and sexually daring, but truthfully follows a pretty standard script around male power. And so things that I want you to think about is about who holds power in that relationship. They might, Anna and Christian might have a contract on what they will do and not do, but still, who has the more power? Who's the wealthier individual? Also age, also gender, right? Does Anna actually have that much power even with the contract? And when you say contract, does Anna give that much consent? They do go over what they will and will not do in regards to explicit sex acts, but is that really consent? Especially in the bedroom and the scenes that they play? And is it also very much enthusiastic consent, which is very important? And lastly, and hopefully this message has gotten across through this entire lecture, that as much as we can overly medicalize women's bodies as, oh, they have a sexual dysfunction, or oh, they are, they're not performing correctly. Real sexual pleasure, especially for women, requires real social change. One is about making, the way to get more orgasms for women, make the world a better place, right? Like if you make a socially gendered just world, women are going to be coming a lot more. And if you also create a society where especially young girls can see positive, affirming images of their bodies, as well as positive and affirming examples and encouragement of the relationship to their bodies, then the whole idea of sexual dysfunction, all of these sort of things that the $1 million pharmaceutical medical industry has been putting into to curing women around their orgasms will not be needed. Because the real core truth is that sexuality is a powerful thing. It is a very powerful thing and is a core part of your identity. And having that power is the most just thing that we can do. And teaching young women, girls especially, to not only embrace their power, but feel emboldened by it fully, and not as sex objects, not as like, oh, I feel empowered because now I can be sexy and men think I'm sexy, but actually like I am fully embracing my own sexuality, my desires, and I will wear whatever I want to wear, and it could be very sexy, but I am doing it because it serves my pleasure. That will be revolutionary. That will make a change in society.